This is United States History 202, Presentation 5, the West, 1865 to 1900. So what we're going to do here is look at what we often call the Wild West or the West, and we're going to talk about what that term means, what the West was like in this period of time, and some of the major issues that were going on in the West that made it a distinctive part of American history. And a lot of this stuff is very popular, popular culture and popular image, but there are some misconceptions about the West, and so we'll talk about that a little bit too. But first and foremost, you have to ask the question, what was the West like? And so if I say the West, immediately you're going to have some things pop in your mind. Maybe it's tumbleweed or cowboys and Indians or outlaws, or you might have an idea of what the climate was like, dry, dusty, hot. And all those things are true, but then there's also the other part of the West. Some parts of the West are very cold, some parts are very wet. You have mountains, you have plains. You did have the outlaws, of course, and the boom towns and all the lawlessness, but you also had people moving west that were sodbusters and farmers. So we're going to talk a lot about this perception of what the West was in relation to the popular image in American culture, and some of the major trends here. So we have that term Wild West, and we're going to look at climate and geography. We'll talk about the outlaws. We'll talk about cowboys and Indians. But then we'll talk about what the majority of the people, what they were like who moved out west. And this really is a dominant trend in American history. The frontier, the moving of the frontier. When Americans or English settlers first land in the 17th century, the East Coast was the frontier. And then they start pushing further west, and then the Appalachian Mountains became the frontier. And then the Mississippi River became the frontier. And then you keep going west, and finally, everything that we consider part of the West now, the Rocky Mountains and the plains and California and all that will become the frontier. And then you've got the Pacific with Hawaii, and you've got Alaska, and all that's the frontier. So there's a lot going on here, and this is a very diverse place, and again, a major trend, Americans continually pushing west. Now, many people immediately think of a wild, unregulated West with countless murders and dozens of outlaws and gunslingers, and the question is this true? Well, to some extent it was. There is a connection, though, with the war between the states, in that a lot of the Confederate veterans who, the war was over in 1865, a lot of these guys went west, and they worked in various things out west, whether it was as cowboys. Maybe they actually joined the Union Army. This did happen. They were called galvanized Union soldiers, or galvanized soldiers. Maybe they worked for railroad companies. They did all kinds of things, and some of them actually became outlaws. And what they thought they were doing was carrying on the war out west in a different way. And we'll talk about that with one of these outlaws in particular. But, of course, everyone's heard of Billy the Kid, and there he is, if you didn't know what he looked like. That's William H. Bonney, Billy the Kid, lived from 1859 to 1881. Famous as a gunslinger, young outlaw, and there's all kinds of theories about Bonney, whether he was actually killed in 81 or if he lived to be longer. But there were a couple of good popular movies on Billy the Kid that came out in the 80s. It was Young Guns, and it was pretty good. The first one in particular was pretty good. And so you have these films. Again, the West becomes captures the imagination of Americans, and you have films and books and all kinds of things about the West, this rugged individual spirit, and that is something that made the West very popular. The Wild Bunch, Butch Cassidy and his gang of train and bank robbers in the 1890s, they were famous or infamous for taking trains and stealing the payroll cars. Now, one thing they got good at was using dynamite. So eventually the railroad companies, they used to have a payroll car, and they would have one guard. Well, they could easily take that. And then the companies started putting in stronger and stronger safes. Well, they would start using dynamite to blow up the safes. And then eventually the company started having a fortified railroad car. It was like a safe. The car was a safe. Well, they blew up one of those and got the money out of it. So no one knew what these guys looked like, though. And then one day when they were in town, they had gone to the pub there, had a little too many drinks, and they walked by a photography studio, and they sat down and said, we're going to get our photograph making, the entire group. And so they did, and there was somebody was walking by that knew them and said, hey, that's Butch Cassidy and the Wild Bunch. And so then that picture was circulated all around the West, and these guys were eventually rounded up because they decided one day to go get a picture made. It's kind of a funny story, but stupid at the same time. Their anonymity was their best calling card, because nobody knew who they were. But now they did. Jesse James is the best connection between the Confederacy and the Wild West. Of course, he did fight in Missouri for the Confederacy. When the war is over, he continues to fight the Union Army by robbing banks and trains. He said this was the money is the Union, and we're going to stop that from taking land, and we're going to get this money back to people that had their land confiscated or their homes, property damaged, wherever the case may be. So Jesse James was a nice example of this transition from the Confederacy to the Wild West. Wild Bill Hickok was a very famous gunslinger in the West, killed in Deadwood, Dakota Territory in 1876, actually shot in the back playing cards. And but he was infamous for his for being a quick draw, a man that had a very quick trigger finger. Doc Holliday, famous for the Wyatt Earp story, of course, from Georgia, and as a young man during the war, but then he headed west. He had tuberculosis, and so he goes west trying to find relief, but known as a card player and a rabble-rouser, but very good friends with Wyatt Earp. And there is Wyatt Earp. Wyatt Earp was a famous lawman, and the Earp family were famous lawmen, not just Wyatt Earp, but his brothers as well. And they're a nice connection of the Union Army becoming the lawmen. So when in places like Kansas and then into Arizona and other areas, these are the guys that were enforcing the law. So these Union soldiers, or former Union soldiers, became the lawmen. So you have the Confederate soldiers, who oftentimes became the quote-unquote outlaws, and the Union soldiers who oftentimes became the lawmen. So the war kind of continues out west in a modified form. All right, well, I mentioned the West has a diverse climate and geography, and it is. It has some of the wettest and driest places in the United States, very high mountains, very low valleys, very cold and very hot climates, tallest trees in the world, but then also vast plains with very few trees. So it's a very diverse climate. In fact, the most diverse place in the United States, the West. I mean, this idea of the West. So the East Coast, from the Mississippi River east, is generally about the same. I mean, you do have areas that are colder than others. But in terms of the amount of rainfall that you get, it's pretty uniform. But once you get west, it becomes drastically different, west of the Mississippi. So everything from like Missouri, Mississippi River, of course, cuts down on the western border of Mississippi. So everything from that, Missouri, Arkansas, that's still the West. Arkansas is the Ozark Mountains. Missouri is still considered kind of the West and the Midwest, but everything past the Mississippi River is considered the West. So you have the Grand Canyon, for example, in Arizona, very dry, big canyon carved out by Colorado River. So extremely interesting place, and you can see the years of layers of rock there. But you also have the Grand Canyon. You have the Yellowstone in Wyoming. Yellowstone Park is actually a big volcano. It's called a supervolcano, so that's why the stone is yellow, all the sulfur in the rock. Giant sequoia tree here in the early 1900s in California. There's Teddy Roosevelt in the middle. So you have these great big trees. The tallest tree in the world, or largest tree in the world, I should say, is the General Sherman tree in California, and there it is. It's over 300 feet tall, massive tree. There's also the General Grant tree, which is in the same area, but a tree that's almost as large. But people come from all over the world to see these things because they're amazing. And of course, here's the chandelier tree in California. It's 315 feet tall and 21 feet wide. You can actually drive a car through it, so they cut a road through this tree. Mount McKinley in Alaska is the tallest mountain in the United States. It's over 20,000 feet at its peak, so very, very tall mountain. And you have the Tetons and the Rocky Mountains there in Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, Idaho. So the Rocky Mountains, very tall peaks. These peaks at the Tetons are about 15,000 feet, so pretty tall mountains there. And then, of course, you have the Great Plains, where it's very vast plains. It looks like there's nothing. I mean, you're just driving and there's nothing there. Very few trees, very few hills. It's just open. You have very cold places like Glacier National Park in Montana. Get a lot of snow, very cold climate. And then, of course, you have very hot places like the Painted Desert in Arizona. So where the temperature gets extremely hot, and other parts of the United States as well get temperatures well over 100 degrees all the time in the daytime, and of course get very cold at night. So that's very dry, but then you have very wet places like the Olympic rainforest in Washington State. It's the only rainforest here in the United States, but very, very wet. Okay, well, so you have this diverse place, and Americans want to know if they can live there. Well, the federal government in 1869 will commission a man named John Wesley Powell to go west and determine this. I mean, can we live out west? What's the climate and geography like? Can people survive here? This is called the Powell Geographic Expedition. And when he comes back, he makes a statement and writes a report saying that the west was not suitable for settlement because it was too dry. There were some places out there that you could settle, but for the most part it's too dry. Even in places like Colorado, it's very, very dry. You just can't live there. You're going to have to, there's not enough water. Well, generally Congress ignores his suggestions, and people begin to move west anyways. And Congress is going to actually stimulate this through land legislation. So this is part of Reconstruction. You know, I know the last unit we focused on Reconstruction, but this is actually part of Reconstruction as well. They're reconstructing the West. They're bringing the West into that process. They're recreating the West. We're going to talk about the Indian tribes, and that was part of it too. But there's a tremendous amount of fraud and corruption in this land legislation. So the first piece of legislation was the Homestead Act of 1862. You can get 160 acres of land if you promise to farm it for 5 years or put a small house on it. So what would often happen is the railroad companies would get this land, they'd stick a house on it, nobody would live there, but they would get the best land. So this would block a lot of these smaller farmers who wanted to go out west. But a lot of people did take advantage of this. They went out west and got a farm, got a homestead, and tried to make a way for themselves. And this is an opportunity that they were willing to take, and this is very tough work, and we'll talk about that in the last slide. The Timber Culture Act of 1873, you get 160 additional acres if 40 acres were used to plant trees. So again, they're trying to get timber out west. So this is still during Reconstruction, 1873. This is still part of the Republican Congress. This was one of the deals that farmers in the West cut, and we'll talk about this when we get to populism. But this coalition of Republicans was generally northeastern bankers and commercial and industrial interests aligned with western farmers. And so long as they had an issue in common, which was blocking the South, and most importantly blocking slavery extension into the West, and keeping blacks out of the West, they were fine. And part of the deal was that if the farmers aligned with these northern industrialists, then they would get legislation like this. Well, what they find out is that later on, during the populist movement, these bankers and industrialists don't really have their best interests in mind, and so you have a split called the populist movement. We'll get into that later in the course. But finally, the Desert Land Act of 1877, you can get 640 acres of land for $1.25 an acre as long as the land was irrigated. So this is another attempt to get people to move out west. All right, one of the popular images we have of the West are cowboys and Indians. So the perception of the West always involves a dispute between settlers and the Indian tribes of the region. Now, this is skewed by the modern media, though, popular culture, and, of course, exaggerated accounts. So the question is, who are the cowboys, and what about the tribes and the Indian wars? Really, what you see here is not necessarily a war between tribes and settlers. It's more of a war between the tribes and the Union Army. So one of the reasons why is because of the pressure that settlers and railroads and farmers are going to put and hunters are going to put on the American bison or the buffalo. This was the center of life for many Plains Indian tribes, and the skins, though, were a prized possession by American hunters. So you have all these buffalo out there. As Americans move west, they see these, they want the skins. The tribes, though, used everything on the buffalo, from the skins to the meat, to the bladder, everything that you could think of, the bones, they used it. So this was a tool for the tribes. Generally, the Americans who were settling out here wanted the meat and the skins, and that was it. In fact, Buffalo Bill Cody made a name for himself, killing buffalo and selling the meat to railroad companies. So what he's going to do, though, while Buffalo Bill is much more important than that, he has his his Traveling Wild West show, which I have a link of that here. You should go out and watch it. This brought the image of the West to the dudes of the East. Now, the term dude is actually a term to describe Easterners. They also called them tenderfoot. Easterners who went out west. But Westerners called Easterners dudes. So it has nothing to do with surfing in California or anything like that. This is a term that comes out of the late 19th century. So Bill Cody has this Traveling West show, which is rather interesting, and this is what people think the West is like. So again, already popular culture is determining what people think the West is like. Now, the buffalo. 4 million were killed between 1870 and 74. In 1865, there were about 15 million bison in the United States. By the 1880s, they were almost extinct, which of course put pressure on the Plains Indian tribes. So this brings us to the Indian Wars, which I put here, 1860 to 1890. This is conflict between American settlers and Indian tribes. And it took place through much of American history. It's very complex. Early in American history, in the Old Southwest and the Old Northwest, many of the tribal leaders were of mixed blood, and tribes had shifting loyalties to European settlers, British, French, United States, Confederate States. So depending on what time and place you were talking about as to what was happening with these wars. But these wars actually stretch back until the 1750s. You have the French and Indian War, and then there's always a conflict between Americans or Europeans putting pressure on the frontier and the tribes fighting to keep their land. The conflict seemed to intensify during and after the war between the states as more people moved west, and government policy encouraged that movement west. So there are several major Indian wars, and almost all these wars took place between the American cavalry in this period and the tribes. So you have the Dakota War, the Navajo Wars, the Red Cloud's War, Colorado War, Comanche Campaign, the Black Hills War, the Nez Perce War. So you can see it's from 1860 or so to 1877, these major conflicts. But I said 1890 because there's actually a major event in 1890. And then this could actually continue out in the Republican Party policies dealing with the Indian tribes. But let's talk about a couple of the important ones. The first, the Dakota War of 1862, took place in Minnesota. This is a conflict between American settlers and the Sioux warriors of the Dakota tribe. You can see it actually is going on during the war between the states. So, and this was not uncommon. Even in Oklahoma, you had a number of the 5 civilized nations of the South that were there: the Cherokee, the Creek, the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Seminole, and there actually many of those tribes are siding with the southern states. So there was an Indian war basically there between the Union Army and the tribes in that area. But in this particular case, the United States is going to win the war. They kill about 100 warriors and then ultimately execute 38 leaders of the tribe at once on the orders of Abraham Lincoln. This was the largest mass execution in American history. So they march out 38 guys, men who wouldn't convert to Christianity and become good American citizens. They decided they'd rather die. And so they build this great big scaffolding and hang 38 of them at one time. And again, this is on orders of the United States government and Abraham Lincoln. So Reconstruction policy towards the tribes already began in the 60s, just like it does in the South in the 1860s. Red Cloud's War from 66 to 68 was the most successful war against the United States. Red Cloud won a series of engagements against the U.S. cavalry and gained almost autonomous control of Wyoming and the Dakotas until the 1890s. But by the 1870s, the United States began using total war tactics in the West to root out these stubborn tribes, and this is because the leaders of this effort were people like William Tecumseh Sherman and Philip Sheridan. Both these guys had used total war tactics during the war in the South. Sherman in his Atlanta campaign, then marched into South Carolina, and he was also commanding general officer of Wilson's raid through Alabama. He wasn't actually on the field with Wilson, but he gave Wilson the opportunity to go and plunder Alabama, which happened. And then, of course, you have Philip Sheridan, who was burning the Shenandoah Valley. So both these guys were well versed in total war strategy, which was not just fight the army, but also wage war on the civilian population. Sitting Bull and the Sioux resist violations of the Treaty of Fort Laramie, which was signed after Red Cloud's War in 1868, which led to the most famous battle of the Indian Wars, the Battle of Little Bighorn. So George Custer and his 7th Cavalry are ambushed in 1876 in the Dakota Territory. This is often called Custer's Last Stand. Custer had set out on his own and was ambushed, surprised and ambushed, and ultimately killed, in fact mutilated. But this was the exception in the Indian Wars rather than the rule. In fact, the cavalry usually won, and the Indian tribes are the ones who were suffering. In fact, in 1877, just 1 year after Little Bighorn, Nez Perce chief Joseph said, "I will fight no more forever." His men, he made a very long speech where he said, "The old men are cold, the children are starving, the children are cold, the young men are fighting, but this is just silly. We're not going to win, so we're going to stop fighting." And generally that's what happened by the 1870s. The last major battle of the Indian Wars, though, took place in 1890 at Wounded Knee. Mostly women and children were cut down by the U.S. in a massacre. The U.S. Army believed that they were doing a ghost dance. This was trying to rekindle some martial spirit against the Union Army, and so they opened fire on these people and killed them, and then buried them in mass graves. Now, the final chapter of the Indian Wars, though, was the Dawes Commission. Henry Dawes of Massachusetts, who was a radical Republican, wanted to integrate the tribes into the United States government through the Dawes Commission, created in 1893. So what Dawes wanted to do was bring Christianity, bring European customs or American customs to the tribes. He wanted to integrate them into American society. They set up the reservation system, which is still there today. But the idea was to bring the American Indian tribes into American culture. What's ultimately happened with these reservations, they become dens of poverty, drug use, vices, prostitution, and so they're the poorest places really in the United States. And this has been a problem for the tribes. So ultimately what happened here is the Dawes Commission ruined any hope of integration. There was always going to be some animosity and stinging animosity towards American policies in these areas because of the policies of the Dawes Commission. All right, so that said, who are the cowboys? I mean, we often hear about cowboys and Indians. Well, the cowboys were around from about the 1870s to the 1880s. These were former Confederate soldiers, black Americans, Mexican Americans, American Indians, Irish. And the cowboys were engaged in what was called open range drives. So what they would do is get the cattle, they would move them from a ranch to a market, and they'd have to go over the land, and the cattle would graze and fatten themselves up, and then they'd get to the rail line and be sold at market. So the job of the cowboy was to herd the cattle, also protect the cattle from any cattle thieves, and keep the cattle in line. So, but this was only feasible when there weren't a whole lot of people living out here, because you didn't have fences to block all this in. Well, eventually, when all the farmers move out there, they start building fences and having farms, the cattle drives go away. And there's a nice map of cattle drives from cattle trails, I should say, from major cities or ranches to railheads in the north, in Kansas and Nebraska and Missouri. Now, the other thing that the West is going to produce are boom towns. Gold and silver, the gold and silver rush out west, which is a big part of Western history, creates these boom towns. These towns would appear overnight and bring with them all the worst elements of society, from crime, gambling, drugs, prostitution, murder, but also possible tremendous wealth. I mean, this is why people were going out there. So they heard about, oh, we found gold in this area, we found silver in this area, and people just flood to it to try to get the gold and the silver. So places like Tombstone, Arizona, and Dodge City, Kansas, and Virginia City, Kansas, and Deadwood, South Dakota, and Bodie, California, and Bannock, Montana. These are all boom towns that pop up overnight, and then sometimes they'll disappear as quickly as they popped up. So gold and silver mining brought a lot of people out west. Rushes began to take place in the 1840s in California. A lot of these people were what you would call pan miners. You go out and you take a pan, you sift in a river, and you might find a little gold there, and you go sell that. But the real work was done by land claims and large mining companies, speculation. And this is where a lot of people either made money or lost money, because they speculate. They say, okay, I think there's gold here, but there wouldn't be, and so they lose a lot of money. Or I think there's gold here, and there was, so they make more money. So this is gambling, is really what it was, that your land is going to produce gold. And it also led to corruption, because people, of course, would lie and sell false claims and all kinds of things. So it's sometimes a area rife with fraud, crime, and vice. Now, the largest strike in the West was called the Comstock Lode in Nevada. It was a Civil War strike, but there was also gold in this area. But it took place between the 1860s and 1870s, and in 2013 dollars, they probably mined between $550 and $660 billion worth of material out of this mine. There's still gold and silver down there as well. They haven't gotten it all out, but they don't go down there and mine it anymore. But deep mining was and still is very dangerous business. The most profitable mining company in the West was the Hearst, Hagen, Tevis & Company, founded by George Hearst. His son, William Randolph Hearst, would be more famous as a newspaperman, but this guy made millions in gold and silver mining. And so this is what would happen. The claims, you have a few pan miners made a little bit of money, but for the most part, the big money is made by the mining companies who have the resources and the material to go and get this stuff deep down in the ground. Now, as these boom towns would dry up, the gold and silver dries up, people would move on, maybe with only small possessions. So these ghost towns dot the landscape of the Old West, and there are a couple of famous, Bodie, California, and Bannock, Montana, because if you go there, the town is basically in a state of arrested decay. You can see what it looks like essentially when people left. There's a picture of Bannock, Montana. And here's a map of some of the gold and silver strikes, and then, of course, turning into ghost towns between 1870 and 1883. Now, as I said, there's tremendous perception and reality, though, of the West. Most people who went west were simple farmers looking to improve their lot in life and acquire land. They were what were called Sodbusters. They go out there and they farm. It's not very glorious, not very glamorous, not very sexy. There's nothing, no crime, no vice about this. People went out and they bought and they built churches, they built schools, they built houses, sometimes out of the sod. But this is what people were doing. They were trying to make a way for themselves, dealing with this very bad environment, very bad weather, rough environment, hot, cold, a lot of snow, very little rain, sometimes violent storms. So, this was almost heroic for these people to do this. They can't go out there. There's no Home Depot. There's no Walmart to get these things. You just got to do it all yourself, and you're kind of isolated. You're cut off from the world. So this is a lot of work, and these people work very hard and to build communities and build farms, and ultimately that's what's going to happen. So these were most of the people heading out west, not the gunslingers, the outlaws, the pan miners, these kind of people. It was mostly farmers who made the West what it was. All right, and that's the last slide for the presentation, so we will pick up with the next slide, presentation 6, next time. See you then.